Black Angel, Black Angels, the untold story of nurses who helped cure tuberculosis, the remarkable and true story of the Black Angels that spanned the Great Depression and moved through World War II and beyond. The story follows the intrepid young women known by their patients as Black Angels. For 20 years, these women risked their lives working under appalling conditions while caring for New York's poorest residents. In the past, she has written in The Guardian, The American Nurse, Narrativity, The Rumpus, Dame Magazine, Forward Lit. But Black Angels is her first book that we know of, her first book that's published. And women's contributions are so often forgotten or erased, and here we are, right? And I did want to say a little bit more, I'm sorry, that she's also award-winning speaker. This past fall, she was a lecturer at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. She was born and raised in New York City, and she holds a Master's of Arts in American Literature and Religion from Boston University, where she was the Luce and Presidential Scholar. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Narratively, The Forward Lit Hub, Writer's Digest, The Emancipator, Newsweek, and other publications. Black Angels won the 2024 Christopher Award in Literature, which celebrates works that affirm the highest values of the human spirit. It has also been named a finalist for the prestigious Gotham Book Prize. Additionally, New York City and state recently honored Maria for outstanding service and positive contribution to the people of New York. The book greatly informed the Staten Island Museum's exhibit, Taking Care, the Black Angels of Seaview, which was on display through November 2024. And this is a quote that really moved me, and it's from Maria herself. She said, "These women saved millions of lives." And she said, and they did it humbly. When I talked to the families, I said to them, "Do you realize what your grandmother or aunt has done?" And they said, "She was doing her job. She just went to work." And that really choked me up. It just chokes me up even now. And I was so inspired to learn that Ms. Smilios went far beyond the role of researcher. Through writing the book, she has become involved in advocating for health equity, especially affordable and accessible TB drugs in TB-heavy countries, by working with and supporting organizations such as NTB, TB Alliance, and Partners in Health. In the past, she's done all this wonderful writing. This book is an important book. This woman is an important woman, and it's so important for us to be paying attention. And as I said to her when I asked her to come speak to us, I said, women's contributions are so often forgotten or erased. And certainly the contributions of women in color seem even more obscured. It's for this reason it's so meaningful to have you share this story with our Historical Society and library participants here tonight. I know I speak for our audience when I thank you in advance for sharing this important history and your scholarship. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me, Mara and Ruthann, and working on this to make this available. Hi, everybody. I'm Maria. And I'm going to talk to you tonight about this book, The Black Angels. It took me a long time to write. So I'm going to give you a nice summary, a little bit more than a summary of the book, and then we'll do a question and answer at the end. So feel free to, if you have any questions, you can put them up in the chat and hopefully we'll get to them. So I'm going to start off by just saying that recently I was talking to one of the family members of the nurses in my book. About the rise in TB cases. She called me, they call me, and she said to me, you hear what's going on about the rise in TB cases? And she said to me, quote, like, my aunt is turning over in her grave at all of this, at the rise in TB, at Trump cutting aid for TB programs and global health, and the scrubbing of Black history. She said to me, all that's going to take us back to those days of injustice at Seaview. And she was right, because tuberculosis has always been a disease of injustice. And the implications of, the injustice on the people who were suffering, but also now I'm going to tell you on the injustice imposed on the nurses who, uh, rose to the occasion in a very similar way as people rose to the occasion, as frontline workers rose to the occasion during COVID. So today I'm going to share with you the Black Angels. The Black Angels is a story about many things: health inequities, stigma, sickness, systemic and institutional racism. It's also about working at a time when resources for tuberculosis were scarce. But at its heart, it's about an exceptional group of women whose narrative today, amid a landscape of anti-science, misinformation, the expunging of history, is as relevant now, if not more so than 100 years ago. Those familiar with the story of Seaview may know that on February 20th, 1952, the cure for tuberculosis was discovered there. But what many don't know is the story behind the story of the Black nurses that until about 18 months ago existed only in the memories of their family. Like so many stories, theirs begins with a twinkling in the universe, where things seem to be aligning for one purpose: to bring certain people together for something world-changing. On a gray day in May in 1929 in the Bronx, Arthur, a 55-year-old man, lay in his home, wasted and wheezing. His wife and 16-year-old child sat bedside, feeling the mist from a rain that blew through the open window, bringing an earthy scent, dulling the smell of disease that for years had permeated the air. The boy moved closer to his father, the man he loved most in the world, and watched as his chest rose and fell, and the distance between each rasping breath grew and grew until finally it stopped, ending 6 years of torment from laryngeal tuberculosis, a, quote, monstrous form of the disease, the boy would later say. 2 days later, this boy buried his father at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Then he went home and tumbled into a grief so deep and vast and powerful that it altered the course of his life. Eventually, this boy would become the man many of us know, Dr. Edward Robichek. As young Edward mourned his father, trying to understand his loss, 12 miles away at City Hall, the Commissioner of Health was mired in a crisis of his own. Suddenly, inexorably, the white nurses at Seaview Hospital began quitting. One by one, they hung up their uniforms and walked out. Their reasons varied. Some cited the 5-hour commute, the successive days of 12-hour shifts, the mental and physical toll their job demanded. But most were leaving to escape tuberculosis, the great white plague, the robber of youth, and its victims, the, quote, infected, incurable, indigent, un-American consumptives. That's who came to Seaview, New York's largest municipal sanatorium. On its floors, hundreds of patients lay in iron frame beds, languishing, their bodies teeming with millions of arrogant microbes that gnawed at their lungs, kidneys, and tongues, their spines and bones and brains. All day long, they sweated and groaned and cried out. They coughed and choked and spit up blood, each hack sending swarms of live germs into the air that landed on bedpans and sheets, tables, chairs, and doorknobs. The bacteria, drifted under beds and down hallways, slinking into every room and corner of the ward. It was always present, hanging in the air, waiting to strike anyone who wasn't already sick. And all it took was a single inhalation. For years, the nurses had watched their colleagues fall ill. They saw how their faces turned ashen, how their eyes burned from a fever that climbed and climbed, and how their skin exuded a sickly odor that no amount of washing could eradicate. Some recovered, at least temporarily. Others died in the wards where they once worked. In those early days of 1929, before the crash, the city thrummed and churned and grew, giving white working women plenty of options for jobs that would not kill them. They could be sales clerks, cashiers, stenographers, librarians, and telephone operators who could work the switchboard at New York Telephone Company's new headquarters, a soaring Art Deco skyscraper, the exact opposite of the dark and sprawling Seaview. Since the 1900s, tuberculosis had plagued the city, finding willing hosts in the waves of immigrants who arrived from all over Europe and found lodging in the Lower East Side tenements. City officials like Dr. Herman Biggs despised these buildings that journalist Jacob Riis dubbed, quote, fever-breeding structures. But more so, he despised the people who lived in them. For years, Biggs had spearheaded an effort to control the spread of tuberculosis through various measures: tent colonies, disease maps, registration laws, posters, and even a health clown named Choo Choo, who, along with his health dog sidekick Cremo, sang ditties about bathing and drinking milk and opening windows to children living in the slums. But nothing worked. And when those failed, Biggs grew desperate and implored the city to build a hospital as a, quote, necessary protection for those who don't have tuberculosis but are exposed to it by the carelessness of others. The city obliged, and in 1913 opened Seaview. Within 2 days, it reached its original capacity of housing 800 sick people. By 1947, the hospital would have 1,800 patients. It would expand over the years, but even at 1,800, that was still 200 over the capacity that it was built to handle. By 1920, though, Seaview had helped the annual death rate in New York City drop by almost half, from 10,000 a year to a little more than 5,000 were dying of tuberculosis. Now, at the end of the 1920s, the nurses were leaving the dream hospital, and Seaview's triumph had become the commissioner's nightmare. Tuberculosis remained the third leading killer in the great metropolis and the fourth globally. Sending patients to other hospitals was impossible. They were all full. If the commissioner couldn't find nurses to staff Seaview, he would be forced to close wards, and hundreds of highly contagious TB patients would converge on the city, their coughs and phlegm flinging active bacilli into the air like confetti. Infection rates would rise, and decades of progress would be reversed. The commissioner would not let that happen. Not on his watch, he said. Seaview would not close. Emergency meetings ensued, and an idea emerged. The city would issue a hiring call the city would issue a hiring call across the South, one similar to those made by recruiters who swayed black sharecroppers and farmers to leave and come north and work in slaughterhouses, steel mills, and factories. Across the country, hundreds of trained Black nurses were qualified, yet or underemployed because of segregation. The city would offer them a package, free schooling, housing, and above all, as they sought, a, quote, rare opportunity to work at one of New York City's integrated hospitals. At the time, only 4 of New York's 29 municipal hospitals hired Black nurses. The call went out. Advertisements appeared in Black newspapers and on church bulletin boards. Recruiters from New York showed up at historically Black colleges, and soon Black student nurses read about the chance for a career in New York City. News spread by word of mouth, moving down the eastern seaboard, across the Mason-Dixon line, through Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas, and deeper into the American South. It didn't take long before the nurses began coming, packing up their lives and dreams and leaving southern cities and rural towns. Alone, they boarded Jim Crow trains and buses and headed north. In talking to the families, I heard how these women were determined to rise above the math that said Black women can't have professional careers or own homes. How the burning desire to heed their calling of caring for those who were left to die and to live a life free from the daily constraints of segregation, the back doors, the yes sirs, the colored fountain and waiting areas, the sidewalk rules, the violence, and whatever else white men had dreamt up and made into law, roused them. These were the yearnings that led them to the wards of a sanatorium, to work with one of the deadliest diseases during one of the most dreadful times in American history, the pre-antibiotic days of the Great Depression that unfolded alongside a country entrenched in the virulency of Jim Crow. But they believed this was their ticket to freedom. During the 1930s and 40s, hundreds of women answered the call, far too many to fit into a single book. But now I want to give you a glance into 2. The call arrived in Savannah, Georgia, one sweltering August day in 1929, 3 months into young Robichek's mourning. It came to 28-year-old Edna Sutton like a reverie, a glorious invitation that reawakened her waning dream of becoming a surgeon or a nurse. Born in 1900 on the floor of a tar paper shack in one of Savannah's shanty towns, such dreams, her family said, were considered fanciful, lofty, outrageous. Black women in Savannah rarely left menial jobs, let alone become surgeons. But Edna's father, an enslaved man, inspired his daughter. In 1899, he walked off his plantation in Confederate Wilkes County, Georgia, arrived in Savannah, and reinvented himself as a preacher. Dream big, he taught her, and Edna's dreams reached the stars. After high school, Edna enrolled in one of Savannah's 2 Black training schools for nurses. The Georgia Infirmary, a small charity hospital that relied on donations and student labor to stay open. It was considered a godforsaken place that strained to serve 1,800 impoverished people a year, a burden that fell on Edna and her fellow trainees who assisted a small staff of overworked nurses. In addition to taking vitals, learning wound care, assisting in procedures, the nurses also mopped and cleaned bathrooms, changed bed linens, and laundered clothes. Despite all the issues, the long hours, and lack of supplies, many times there weren't enough shrouds to bury the dead, Edna loved her job. In the words of her family, she had, quote, found her calling. But after 2 years of training, the school let her go, and Edna joined the hundreds of Black nurses who were unemployed and whose dreams were thwarted because the same country that drew lines around water fountains and bus stations also drew them around hospitals. So Black nurses were only allowed to work in Black hospitals. At the time, there were 260 Black hospitals in America versus 6,000 white hospitals. The white hospitals preferred to remain understaffed rather than hire Black nurses. Edna spent years working as a clerk and taking care of her younger sister, 20 years her junior, after she was let go. And then one August day, she learned about Seaview and applied, because what Edna wanted most in her life was a professional career, one that would allow her to pursue her dream of medicine and make her enough money to buy a house in a place where she didn't have to look at those signs telling her where she could sit, where she could walk, where she could go to school, a place where her younger sister would have opportunities that she could only ever imagine. Seaview, she believed, was that place. After a harrowing year at Harlem Hospital, Edna began working as a post-operative nurse in Seaview's surgical ward. So this is an interesting slide because if you notice, there are no overhead lights. And it wasn't until the early 1930s that Seaview's operating rooms got overhead lights. Before then, they did surgery by the whims of the light that came in through the window. For years, Edna listened to patients who asked about the operations with terrifying names, thoracoplasty, lobectomy, and frenetic nerve crush. And then she tried to quell their anxiety about dying. Day and night, Edna and her colleagues were tasked to sit with the dying and watch as tuberculosis exacted its price. In one man, the disease had pulverized his lungs, nearly liquefying them. As he lay dying, coughing up blood and clumps of mucus, it was Edna who had stayed with him through the night, placing ice chips on his lips and telling him things were all right, even though they weren't. In the morning, his body finally shut down, ending his torment. Nights like these were par for the course, and Edna quickly came to understand that few places were darker than Seaview. But until there was a better treatment for tuberculosis, this is where she was called, to this island, to these people that the city had damned. There were many others like Edna who committed themselves to caring for the sick and destitute people of New York City. Clemmy Phillips, Virginia Green, Curleen Jennings Bennett, Leola Washington, and Missouri Lavinia Meadows Walker, who came via Howard University determined to put down new roots and advocate for the integration of Black nurses into the American Nurses Association, which did not let them join until 1949. And there was also Virginia Allen, who at 93 is one of the last living Black angels. The other living Black angel is a woman named Curleen Jennings Bennett. That's Virginia Allen. The niece of Edna, she came in 1947 during a dire nurse shortage set off by the war. At a mere 16 years old with no nursing experience, she was hired as an aide in a children's hospital whose hollowed out remains now stand in a jumble of dense forest. Back then, when its wards were filled with 250 children, many said it was, quote, the saddest place in the world, a place where the disease reared itself in uglier ways, in the rows of cribs and beds, in the walkers and wheelchairs, in the toys that lay strewn on blankets or tossed under and around the beds. So right before the pandemic, I think it was 2019, everything's all mixed up in my head now. I went down to Seaview. So Virginia lives in the restored nurses residence, which is located in the compound of Seaview, and she's surrounded by all the abandoned buildings. They have in the surgical ward, they had turned the downstairs into a kind of mock museum and set up these rooms. And so we had walked through there and videotaped her. And so I want to give you an opportunity to hear her voice and to explain a little bit about this room. So here we go.
Or 25, and the children always found ways to get out, but they couldn't unlock it except that they pressed on this little button. But you know, kids climb out of cribs all the time. And this machine here, it's very old, is called a respirator. And the name of it just eluded me, but it'll come back. Emerson respirator. The child would be inside here, this big machine, and it would be closed. And the only ports that we had to work on the child would be through here. And of course their head would be out there. And they were in this machine to help them breathe.
Is that the iron lung?
Yes, this is a child's size, what they call the iron lung. It breathed for the patient. There's mechanism in here, and this was a port here where you could put the child in. But these are old machines, no longer used, but the concept hasn't changed over the years. It's just a little more fancy looking.
Did you find it cumbersome to work on a child in one of those?
No, because you're trained how to do it. And
Were they in pain?
sometimes. I had excellent training here. I would say superb. The nurses who worked here were educators, even on the floors. And we had an education department in the building that I live in now, the nurses' residence. On the first floor, they had several rooms that were set up like classrooms because we had a rotation of nurses who came from Howell Hospital and Lincoln to do their infection controlled rotation. So that was wonderful. I learned a lot.
How long would a child stay in one of those?
It could be any length of time. It's according to their condition.
So for the nurses, they told me that, quote, comforting the children was very difficult. They were fussy and wheezy and irritable. Some threw things, food, toys, pillows, and then sniveled for hours. A good handful of them fumed. Their faces and necks turned red and their fingers clenched into small fists. They shouted and thrashed and threw long-lasting tantrums.
Or 20.
Wait.
Or 20.
Sorry, I want to get to the other slide. In the daily logbook, the nurses chronicled the days, quote, Anthony quite miserable, Ruth listless and helpless, Bobby many lesions on face crusted over, Andrew appears partially paralyzed. That's actually a logbook from 1945. I made a mistake on the date, but this is from 1945. And on went the somber narrative. When women like Misuria and Edna and so many others came to Seaview, no one told them that here people were sicker than anyone should ever be allowed to become sick, that here people remained for years. I looked at hundreds of medical cards that told the story. Length of stay, 465 days, 800 days. One card read 1,019 days, 3 straight years at Seaview. For these people, time fell away. They became desperate and depressed, and their voices were laced with a dark and faded bitterness, a resignation reserved only for the gravely ill, and only for places like this, where life was lived in the shadow of death. And where the nurses became mediators who constantly straddled the world of the living and the world of the dying. Essentially, what these nurses were doing was palliative care before palliative care was a part of nursing. And all the while they dealt with the institution personified by their supervisor, Miss Lorna Doone Mitchell, a Teutonic white woman, the daughter of a Confederate medic who wielded her power in perverse ways. She refused to let them transfer. She lurked in hallways hoping to catch them doing something wrong. And she prevented them from wearing masks on a regular basis. Masks, she said, made the nurses complacent. According to the nurses, Miss Mitchell had a gaze that, quote, could freeze the devil himself. Then there was the racist vision of some city officials, that the nurses, like the patients they cared for, were simply expendable. In 1933, at a meeting in Manhattan that was attended by over 300 city officials, nurse administrators, and nurses themselves, the president of hospitals was talking. And when he finished, a young Black nurse stood up and said, "Mr. President, why do you send Black nurses to Seaview?" And he replied, quote, "The reason we send Black nurses to Seaview," he said, "is because in 20 years, we won't have a colored problem in America because they'll all be dead from tuberculosis." But they didn't die. Instead, in the face of such impediments, they persisted, giving us the ending we all know. The one beginning on February 20th, when the New York Post prematurely broke the news about a cure by carrying the banner headline, "Wonder Drug Fights TB," and in a single galvanizing moment changed the course of history. It was triumphant, and as Dr. Robichek later said, quote, "None of it would have been possible without the nurses." But then no one cared about their story. If you look closely at the most iconic picture taken from that day, the one that we would say went viral because this was all over the world, was reproduced, this photograph. And actually it was taken by a very famous photographer named Nat Fine, who captured Babe Ruth's bowing out of baseball. You can see the once incurables are at the front, center, and jitterbugging. In the back stand the Black nurses, their faces staid and somber. They tell a different story, a more complex one of women who saw terrible things, who in these buildings did the impossible, prevail over humanity's greatest scourge, tuberculosis, who followed orders from physicians who themselves were at a loss, working through trial and error and prescribing unreliable medications that often made people sicker, who stood in surgical rooms watching operations turn to butchery, ribs being sawed off in bushels 6 to 8 at a time, chest cavities being punctured and opened and stuffed with ping pong balls, wax packs, and fat to collapse the lungs. They did it because it was their job, because they had committed themselves to saving lives at the risks of their own, but also because they were Black women, subjects of Jim Crow's labor laws that offer them few, if any, options. I want to believe that we've moved far away from many aspects of this story, but I fear, especially now and in the coming years, and particularly with the attack on science, we have not. Daily, there are attacks on science and history, and with each one, I can't help but think about the Black angels, who had been erased from history for 80 years, and because of that, there had been an entire narrative about tuberculosis and the cure crafted without them. Over the 8 years that I was writing this book, some people expressed sadness that they weren't part of this history. Others expressed outrage, but most people expressed gratitude that finally history would be righted. And now we stand at a moment when so much of history is in jeopardy of vanishing, including this one. I am trolled on social media. I'll post something and people will, find it, LOL, this isn't true. Or I receive emails from people telling me that my whole book should be erased because it's woke. Recently, I received an email from somebody in Staten Island, and he said, my aunt worked at Seaview, and she worked there along the Black nurses, and she never talked about any racism. She always got along with the nurses. So the story is a lie. Anyway, they can have their opinion. In graduate school, I studied with Dr. Elie Wiesel, an Auschwitz survivor, who talked in depth about what it meant to bear witness, what moral obligation we had as human beings when we heard or read or witnessed something that was unjust. His class changed me and the decision of how I wanted to live my life and use my voice. When I learned about this story, I couldn't turn away from the inaccuracy of the way it had been crafted, the way the whole tuberculosis narrative had been crafted, and the myriad injustices that these women and the sick that they cared for had faced. So what I want to end with is just to say that history matters. This history matters. I do believe there is hope, but it is up to us to keep that hope going. We need to come together to collectively remember that no one deserves to be erased from history, and that this story at its core is heartbreaking and many times infuriating, but ultimately it is a story of triumph, of humanity, and one that reminds us, and this is where I really do find the hope, that there are always people who are willing to take care of us. We saw this in COVID, people rising to occasions when most of us, could only dream of doing that. And there's going to always be people who will selflessly commit themselves to working on the front lines of medicine. But mostly, please remember, it's a story about women who, despite all the obstacles thrown their way, found the will and determination to make the world a better place, one where equity and compassion, morality, love, and bearing witness are the guiding principles. So thank you. And I'm happy to take questions and, put them in the chat. I just want to say one thing. So this, if you buy the book and you want to buy it from Amazon, please do not buy the blue paperback version. It's cheaper, but it's an unauthorized pirate version. It's shoddy, and this is the only official version in the United States, the hardcover. So, if you shop at Amazon, you could buy it anywhere, Barnes and Noble, your local store. And so, yeah, that's it. But let's, if we want to, let's do questions, answers, if we want.
Maria, I would start us off. 2 questions. What led you to write this book and, pick this topic? And my second question is, what is the status of the building? Is the building just going to stay that way? I was curious.
So I came across the story. I was a science editor, and I was doing a book on orphan lung diseases, which are like 1 in a million lung diseases. And the doctor made this allusion to Seaview Hospital. And I've always had this, kind of obsession and fascination with disease and how it moved through the city, and anything like sanatoriums just kind of always appealed to me. And so the line said, he was hoping this medication was going to be as swift as the cure for tuberculosis was at Seaview Hospital. And I Googled it, and the story, it came up, right? I was born and raised in New York. My family immigrated from Greece. So I was pretty well versed on New York history, or so I thought. And this story came up, but alongside of it was a story about this cadre of Black nurses called the Black Angels. And then I began to kind of, do my deep dive. I fell down this Google rabbit hole, and finally I got in touch with Virginia Allen. And then I found Dr. Robichek's son, who was alive at the time. He gave me his dad's archives. In those archives were the names of the original trial patients. And so I just started cold calling people, and I tracked down 2 of them who were still alive. And that's how it came about. The story came about. What was the second question? I forgot.
About the building. I mean, it looks like
Oh, yeah, the buildings
it's
are
in
in
such
pretty bad shape.
horrific shape.
Yeah. So they've landmarked some of the surrounding buildings, but the pavilions, though there are 4 of them remaining, the other 4 had been razed, and it's a rehab center now. The city just is letting them deteriorate because they have this vision to build on it, and so they're just fallen into complete and utter disrepair. It's the saddest thing in the world. It is so, so sad. Even sadder is that little museum. They turned it into a COVID testing center. And so there's like a hole in the ceiling and all of that stuff, you know, that crib and that iron lung, you could see it on the side, had begun to like deteriorate. That was before COVID. Now it's even worse because it got water damage. It's very sad.
So feel free to unmute if you have a question, or raise your hand, or even better, put it into the chat for me.
Oh, I think Ruth Ann has a question. Oh,
Yes.
and then there's Susan also after.
Excellent.
Thank you. My question is, that wonderful nurse that you interviewed in the building that is now looking
Mhm.
like a defunct,
Virginia,
seems to
yeah.
be- Yes, Virginia, thank you. And she talked about the building she lived in, a nurse's building. Could you talk about
Yeah.
that a little?
So she lives in the restored nurses building, which is in the middle of the Seaview complex. So it was the original nurses building.
Is that
Where-
still okay?
They restored it. So
Oh.
it's a historical building. They restored it and they sold, you know, they didn't, it's now an assisted living facility. So that's where she lives. And then you walk out her door and you see the children's hospital. It's literally like 500 yards from her front door.
Thank you.
Feet, sorry, not even. Susan.
Hi. I just want to thank you so much. I read this book earlier this year, and
Oh, thank you.
I am a public health nurse, and this is a subject that I work with. And I learned so much, and I was just so in awe and impressed with the compassion and the thoroughness. Your
Thank you.
mastery of the subject, the way you conveyed it. I just loved this book and have recommended it so widely. So
Oh, thank you so
so
much. Thank you for saying that. There's a question in the chat. In what specific ways did these TB nurses help find the cure for TB? That's a great question. So the nurses were the ones on the front lines administering the medication. And so when isoniazid was introduced, you know, when they Hoffman LaRoche is the one who compounded the drug, and they called in May of 1951, they called Seaview and they called Dr. Robachek's colleague, and they said, hey, you know that drug we've been testing on tuberculosis on mice and guinea pigs? It looks promising. Do you want to test it on humans? And they said, yes, we do. So within 2 days, these trials had been set up. They had never tested it on humans, and so they were titrating the medication based on a formula used for mice and guinea pigs. The nurses were tasked not only to administer the medication, but to watch these 92 patients, which were part of the initial trial, for emotional, you know, they looked every day, they would fill out a form about their emotions, about side effects, you know, and the thing was, the nurses knew these patients because they had been there for years. The patients that were, the criteria for the trials was death had to be imminent. So these people had been in and out of Seaview. They called themselves, quote, lungers. They were terminal, and the nurses knew them, and they knew their personalities. So what they did was they looked at the physical, the psychological, the mental, and they started to compile whatever they saw. So for example, one of the things that they started noticing was people were complaining about ringing in the ear. And so they would write these down, and at night, Robichek and his colleague would come, take the charts, go downstairs, and literally would collate them. And so they started these Excel spreadsheets, and it was because of them that they were able to say, oh, hey, when the medication hits this level, 50 people are complaining of dizziness. Maybe we shouldn't go that high. And that's how the initial trials took place. But it took 9 more years for them to find the right cocktail of medications and Seaview to close. So they were the ones who collected all of this data day in and day out. And Robichek, had it not been for them, none of it could have happened. He couldn't take care of 92 patients.
We want to go to Marlene next. She has her hand up.
Hi, thank you. I'm Marlene Harris, and I too am a nurse as well, and I am
Hi.
a Black nurse as well. So I was very, very proud to read the story. Thank you so much for writing the story.
Thank you.
Yes, and I have to tell you, I'm originally from New Jersey, and it wasn't until I read your book that I realized that Rutgers University and the Huffman LaRoche had such a huge, part in tuberculosis research. The other part that saddened me is I also went to nursing school in New Jersey, never heard any of this, which is the sad part, because this is the history that our nurses, that people in general will not know about. And I think it's important to bring light to these stories, but also to make sure that they're taught, because this is true history. And I think that I totally agree with you with the concerns that you have moving forward. But it's a part of history that that especially as a nurse and a nurse of color, we don't learn about. So I hope that more stories will come out. And I'm also a part of a nursing organization. I'm with the Northern Connecticut Black Nurses Association, which is a part of the National Black Nurses Association, and had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Virginia Allen in November. Dynamic 92-year-old, phenomenal woman. So I, again, thank you for your book, and I hope that this is taught in all of our nursing schools as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I mean, in the year and a half that the book is out, I've done over 150 talks, and I say it again and again, like, I hear the comments that you're saying. I've never heard about this. Why isn't it taught? Why is it now being integrated into the curriculum? There are a few schools that picked it up, but it's not enough. I say it, people ask me all the time, and I say, it's, you have to integrate it into your curriculum. I can introduce you to it. I can talk about it. I hoped at some point, I've kind of abandoned that hope, that the American Nurses Association, or, one of the bigger, like the American Association of Nurse Practitioners invited me to their conference last year to give a keynote. So, 2,200 people heard about the story. With Virginia was there as well. And I know there's a lot of politic in nursing. I'm not a nurse. I've just observed it as an outsider. So I wish I have tried my best. Like, I have written, I have appealed to them, I have basically begged them to, really get this story out there, because now it is more important than ever. They really do. I mean, I'm going to keep talking. Those people that troll me, I think are funny in a way. They need to get a life. But that's what concerns me, that people want to try and erase the history again. So I just wanted to comment on your comment that I try my best to get this story out there as much as possible. And I really hope that schools do start to adapt it into their curriculum, or even a part of it. All they have to do is like read an article about it, just don't have to read the whole book. There's tons of articles on it. There's tons of videos of Virginia talking, and the other Black angel too. That's the other thing. There's 2 living people that you could actually have them zoom in. So anyway, I'll stop talking, but.
Tova had a question. What was the cure you have referenced? Is it still in use?
Yes, that's the crazy part about it. Isoniazid, the cocktail of isoniazid and the other drugs, is still a gold standard for tuberculosis that is not multi-resistant tuberculosis. These women helped to save tens of millions of lives from 1951, which is the other mind-boggling thing. It wasn't just that it's nursing history. This is infectious disease history. That drug is still in use today.
Next up is Lynette, who was my son's wonderful teacher. Her comment is, my mother, Estelle Taylor, late of Bloomfield, attended Lincoln School of Nursing from 1938 to 1941, receiving
Wow.
an RN. She loved sharing her experiences in the Bronx. I believe these angels want us to remember their best experiences along with the tragedies. To what do you attribute the survival of the nurses while caring for their patient?
That is a great question, because the families talked a lot about that. So there's a couple of things. Number one, they followed the protocol of the day to the T. They took off their clothes when they went inside, very similar to COVID. You know, there was this idea that tuberculosis gets stuck on the clothing. It doesn't, but they did it anyway. They were, you know, very, very conscientious about washing their hands, and about keeping their families away from any possible infection, you know, from tuberculosis. All of them tested positive. The other thing they did is they had deep spiritual practices, you know, very religious. They went to church, but I'm not talking about like dogmatic kind of, oh, you know, like these miracles of staying of safe. They were scientists. These women really believed in the science, but they had this deep faith, and also they had fun. They were so much fun. They loved going to baseball games. They used to go out to dinner. They started clubs. Edna started a fishing club because her younger sister had learned to fish when she was staying with her brother in Washington, D.C. before she was able to bring her up north. And so she started a fishing club. They loved, when they were younger, going to Harlem. And so they really had self-care when it came to that aspect of themselves. These women were not women who complained. Their families said, you know, they really didn't talk. It's not like now where people come home and, you know, we talk about our jobs. They didn't talk about their jobs. They went to work and they did their job. So yeah, they had fun.
Ruth Ann said Mrs. Taylor certainly had faith and knew how to have
Yeah.
fun.
The other thing is, I do want to add, they were a very tight-knit community, and they knew that to get ahead, they needed to stay united. And that's not to say that all of them, you know, there were like thousands of nurses that passed through Seaview. You know, this wasn't this like kind of kumbaya, everybody got along all the time, you know. But when it came to the important things, like wanting equality, you know, wanting to fight redlining, wanting to be able to transfer between hospitals, they were, like I say, they were so tight knit. You know, it was like an impenetrable wall. And that, I think, is something that we can take away from the book, especially in today's world, where it seems like everyone is kind of all over the place, and they had this patience, and they knew it was going to, they had their eye on the long game. They knew. They had been working to desegregate the American Nurses Association and join it since 1908. 41 years they waited. And it went from one generation of nurses to another, to another, to another. And that is, I think, a really crucial lesson in terms of not just tenacity, but in what is important. And in saying to the next generation, you got to keep fighting and keep going. It will happen.
There's a comment from Deidre. Thank you so much for this presentation. Today, more than ever, we need to know our history of infection control, as the deniers are putting us at huge risk. As a nurse who practiced infection control during the AIDS epidemic and loved Dr. Fauci, the measles is a scream to demand CDC.
Yeah, I did a talk for Partners in Health with 2 other TB authors, and you know, the moderator was a global expert in tuberculosis, and we talked about this, you know, the cutting of US aid and how it's detrimental, not just to the United States, but you have entire small healthcare systems collapsing now. TB
Am I
clinics.
on?
Yes, you
Yes,
can
yes.
comment, Deidre.
I was going to say, you know, I'm not a good typist, and I was having a problem getting in. I am absolutely appalled with how with USAID, which is our frontline soft care of politics, but it's, you know, the Marburg virus, AIDS, TB, which is much more prevalent right now, from my understanding, in Eastern Europe. And they're doing a lot of work there, but all of this is affecting us now. And I really appreciate you opening the door to the history. And I remember hearing about the architecture, the side porches became prevalent in the Hartford area during the TB epidemic here.
I have so much to say about that, but to acknowledge, yes, absolutely. And I think that people don't understand the global impact, you know, and that is a problem that needs to be fixed, because the idea that the world depends on America for a healthcare system is just, it's overwhelming. And we are seeing now that it's like a drain, you know, all of these countries are just like, I'm just going to talk about tuberculosis now. It's kind of just falling apart.
Yes.
And that is a problem. You know, the other problem is that what people don't realize is that the implications here, you know, when you take away all of these protections, it's, as I said, tuberculosis is an injustice. It's always been a disease of injustice. And what's being perpetrated on the American people and around the globe by the administration is an injustice on our public safety. And the word public is crucial here, because you're putting the public at risk, not just of getting diseases, of filling hospitals, of having a shortage of frontline workers, which we already have a shortage of since COVID. And more importantly, a risk of another pandemic, which, my God, the last thing we want with this administration in place is another pandemic. And so the implications just keep going on and on. There's also economic implications. Look what happened with COVID, when you have to start shutting down. So it goes beyond just the health. Somebody said, can you put the QR code again so I can order the book? So I can't do, I have to share the screen, but what I would urge you to do is, if you just Google Black Angels book, you can either buy it, if you want to buy it at Barnes and Noble, or you can buy it at Barnes and Noble, or you can go to Amazon and just put in Amazon, but don't buy the blue one if you do it from Amazon. Or if you put in Penguin Random House Black Angels, it will take you to the publisher site, and then it gives you a list if you want to get it, I don't know, Target, Walmart, your indie store. Did any of the nurses or family members die? So that's a great question. Along with the deteriorating buildings is also the deteriorating human resources folders and patient folders. So we don't know how many died of tuberculosis. In the, you know, kind of, I would say almost like 60 or 70 people that I've met, families of the Black nurses, the Black Angels, none of them died of TB. They all tested positive, but none died. A few got active tuberculosis, so they had latent tuberculosis, and a few got active, but they recovered. So, I mean, they must have died. I just don't know how many.
Were those files like purposely lost, or was it more because of the condition of the buildings?
I think a combination of both. There's some really like pretty stringent gatekeepers at Seaview who don't want to let go of that stuff, and so it could go into proper museums. But those files had just been neglected. It's a kind of like, you know, the city hospital system, like once something closes, files get sent all over the place, or they just, they're in those buildings. There's a floor full of them deteriorating. Can you catch TB by drinking unpasteurized milk? You know, that's a great question, because there is bovine tuberculosis. So I am not sure if you could get it from unpasteurized milk. And I'm actually going to look into that when I get off, because I never thought of it like that. You know, there is bovine tuberculosis, which they say could have been what started TB from humans, because it lives in the soil, and it could have come from animals, and then,
I think I can answer that. This is
Oh,
John.
yay.
And I used to treat TB patients in
Oh,
New
hello.
York. especially during the AIDS epidemic. But yes, bovine TB can very well come from unpasteurized milk. It has just not been a big outbreak because it has just not been that in that widespread use. But yes, M. bovis from unpasteurized milk. Don't drink it. Don't
Oh
drink
my
it.
goodness, now we have another thing to worry about. There you go. See, like all this like crazy, anti-science stuff as if the facts don't matter. But thank you, John, for having for having an answer at hand here.
And I
learned
wanted
something.
to add, Dr. Capodanno is also on the board of the Wintonbury Historical Society.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure to meet you virtually.
So I just want to respect your time, Maria, but maybe one more question if
Yeah.
anybody has. I mean, we really appreciate that you took
Yeah,
your
no
time
worries. I mean,
to
if there's a
come
few
to
more
us.
questions, I'm happy to answer. What can the public do to save and restore the small museum? I don't know. I think it's a huge uphill battle. I guess unless some like really well-known person swooped in and started to like shine light on it, not very much. I have tried to spearhead that a few times and it's just kind of fallen into the ether. And I think part of that is that it's so big. The complex is so big and the buildings, some have been landmarked and others haven't. The fire department has the children's hospital now and they train there. The firemen train in there. Yeah. One of the churches is turned into, they rent the space to a theater and another section of it is like an inpatient recovery center for addicts. So it's been doled out to different places. So that's what makes it difficult. Have I met John Green? Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, I did a panel with him, 2 panels last year for the United Nations, actually in 2018, 2023, the UN high-level TB meeting was in New York City, obviously. And so we did 2 author panels together. And I keep missing him on this. He sent me a message the other day, I congratulated him on his book. So yeah, I have met him. He's wonderful. He's a great guy. He uses his voice in a really good way. And I'm happy that he's getting tuberculosis out there on the map. Because only he could do something like that, get people to pay attention to TB. So it's wonderful. Would they put something in the Smithsonian? I'm working on that.
Oh, good.
So I don't know if it's going to happen, but it's something I've been working on. It's something I wanted. There were 2 things I wanted when the book came out. Well, there's a number of things I wanted. I was hoping somebody would do a movie of it. That's not happening yet. I was hoping that they would get the congressional gold medal from the president. That takes a long time. That's not about to happen right now. And then the Smithsonian. So the Smithsonian, that's we're talking. So hopefully that will come to pass. But things are so kind of harried right now with funding that is putting a kind of crimp in a lot of things going forward.
My question is similar to Jeff's. What's the next book, Maria?
Oh, I don't know. I keep saying I'm going to stop talking about this one and I keep getting pulled into talking about it, which I love because I could keep talking about it because I love the story. So I'm not quite sure. I was going to, before the elections, I was thinking of doing the American caregiving crisis because I had cared for both of my parents who died of cancer separately. And both were denied long-term care for different reasons. But then when this administration got elected again, I was like, you know what? I don't think I can do this. Like, I can't dive into healthcare now because everything is so unstable. It would be like me doing research only for it to change the next day. So I don't know. I haven't decided yet. But I keep talking about this book, so I'm happy to do that.
Ruth Ann has a question.
It's not so much a question, it's a big thank you.
Oh,
I mean,
thank you.
I just want to say, please keep talking about this book. It's so important. on so many levels. And I can't thank you enough. I mean, I heard you on NPR, and now you're here. You're literally here with us in Bloomfield.
Oh,
And
thank you.
and your message is very important on so many levels. And
Thank you.
certainly the healthcare and the needs we have in healthcare, but particularly in a town like Bloomfield, where we have so many people of color and so many people who understand what it is to look at an erased history of
Mhm.
very, very important people doing very important things. And I think of nurses as erased in a lot of ways. I mean,
Yeah.
doctors get all the credit, whatever. But years ago, I took a course in death and dying, and the guy said doctors are trained to cure, nurses are trained to care. But I just, you're very special, Maria.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
I-
And
you're-
thank you for inviting me. It's
you know, this is very, I've learned a lot, and I think we've all learned a lot, and I can't thank you enough. I would say stay the course.
I mean, yeah, I'm going to keep doing it until I figure something else out, and then I'll keep doing it because I have a few things like even at the end of next, like in September, like colleges that are, their semesters are finishing now. So in September, but if can just try in your own ways to like uplift these women, that's the
Great.
best that we could do to keep getting their story out there and why
This
it's
is
so
a
meaningful.
courageous story, a courageous.
Yeah. And it's so, so meaningful, for not just nursing, but global health right now. Like it really is important. Somebody raised their hand, Elizabeth.
Yes, Elizabeth.
Yes, I've been sharing this quote to so many people, so please forgive me if you've heard it already from me. But this is from Michelle Obama, and she said, "History has shown us that courage can be contagious and hope can take on a life of its own." And I just think, there's all these concerns about what's going on, and I just say that quote to myself now and then and keep on moving. And I
Yeah.
hope you will too, Maria. Thank you for what you've
Yeah.
done.
Thank you. And you're right. And that's why I said there is hope, but there's hope, I think, there's hope when we come together. Like we can't be disunified, and I think that's what's happening now every day is this new, like everybody's like kind of frazzled. And I
Yes.
think we just have to, like what these nurses did, you stay and you have your eye focused on whatever the long game is. And if that's just, I think keeping the public safe right now is huge, like that we remain like, I went to the doctor and I was like, hey, is my measles vaccine still okay?
Yeah.
I just don't want to get measles. It's there's not a political statement. I just don't want to get sick is really what it is. I mean, obviously, I don't want anyone to get sick, but at the most basic level, if we can say we are protected and, for the younger generation, I have a daughter, and she went through the first presidency. She's 14 now. Now she understands, so as much as I want to crawl into bed, I just get up every day and, you try and find these moments where you point people to and say, like, as I said, on this call earlier 2 days ago, humanity has been here before. Like, we're nothing special at the moment. We're going through this like dark period, but when you think about the Holocaust, when you think about World War I and World War II and this, the Spanish flu, and we have been, Jim Crow, we have been in these awful places before and people have prevailed. And I think we need to remember that because it's really easy. And that's where I think that hope about courage, that quote comes in. We have to remember that we have been here before and there will find a way out. It's going to be difficult. I'm not going to take that away. And it's probably going to make a lot of us sick, literally and mentally. So,
Is your book going to come out as an audio and large print too?
It is. It is an audio book. I heard the audio is amazing. I don't narrate it, but the woman who narrated it was like lauded by Audible last year for her narration of the book. I've heard it's amazing.
I'm gonna try and buy the audio. That's excellent.
Um,
And
St.
also,
Joseph's-
a great idea is the Afro-American Museum in DC, which is
That's who we're talking to, the Smithsonian there.
yes.
That's one of the museums that we're in contact with. St. Joseph's University in West Hartford has a progressive nursing program, great contacts there. Well, if anybody has a contact there, like just, you know, if you can send it to Ruth Ann or Mara, they can pass it on to me and I could reach out to St. Joseph's University.
Yeah, Deidre, would be great if you need the email for Maria, please contact me and I could get you guys together.
I'll just put it in the chat.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
And if anybody has any questions, feel free to.
Oh, and of course, Ruth Ann has a contact there.
Of course, I'm so sorry. Maria, I will be in touch with you via email because
Okay,
I have a very close contact there who's in
Great.
charge of the African American portion of the Smithsonian. And I'll be in touch with you.
that's awesome.
He's a former
UConn
colleague.
actually had a great program. They did a beautiful program for us last year, and they have integrated the book into their curriculum.
So guess
that-
what? That's my daughter, Mallory, who's on right now.
Good.
Oh, okay, that's awesome. Yeah, they did an amazing, it was like 300 people. They had the news there. And they integrated the book into their curriculum. They had all the faculty read the book. So, I was a COVID nurse and now do clinical trial. Wow. The
You-
COVID nurses are like,
She
You
had
know.
no graduation because it was full COVID and she had to
Oh.
take the boards, her and her sister, and then they went right into working. She did med surge and her sister did the emergency room.
oh
You
my
should
God.
be
It's
proud,
like-
Mara.
Straight from RN.
I stand in awe of all of those people. I was at COVID Ground Zero, a mile from Elmhurst Hospital, where the nurses were wearing garbage bags. And it was the most appalling thing that I was, I mean, there was a lot of shame at that point, but I was just like, are we garbage bags?
Mm.
Like, how is
Oh.
that happening?
Mhm.
So,
Maria,
Yeah.
this is John again.
hi.
I'm the outgoing president of the Wintonbury Historical Society, and I've been looking forward to this for well over a month. And
Aw,
sure,
thank you.
I missed the first 15 minutes, so I'm just going to have to go buy your book and read it. And I'm really looking forward to it. And I'm
Thank
sure
you.
we'll be doing a presentation if Ruth Ann has anything to say about it. We will have something because this is too important. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for saying that. And I think you can watch the first 15 minutes too, right?
Yes.
You recorded it.
Yay.
I'll send you the link, John. And Elizabeth, you have your hand up, but was it from last time or do you have something else to add? Oh, you're muted.
Elizabeth.
'Cause-
I'm sorry, no, I didn't take it down.
oh, no problem. No problem. So I think we're good. And
Thank
please
you.
contact me if I can help connect you to Maria in any way. And
Yeah.
feel good about Ruth Ann. She has that contact at St.
Yeah,
Joe.
that's great. I thank you everybody for spending this evening with me. It was a lot of fun, and have a really wonderful rest of your night. And thank you so much.
Grateful, very grateful. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
You're welcome.
You.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.